What is the truth of the matter? Today, we will cover it on the IBS Freedom Podcast. Amy, what did you think of my intro? Did you like it?
Very Shakespeare. I don't know.
I secretly am an actress. I just have never gotten a part before. But
okay.
Seriously, we're going to be talking about true root causes. So do you want to just rip this one right open and maybe give a couple of examples of things that are not actually root causes, but sometimes they are said to be by well-intentioned practitioners or people of the internet? What is a false root cause? Here's another way to frame it.
Yeah, I think that there's a bunch of them. And I know we've talked about before just the idea of digging to the root of the root of the root. Like there's usually more. But I think the big ones that come to mind, one, are things like SIBO, leaky gut, candida. Even really, I think most microbiome things, I think, have a cause, have a root of the root. Now, again, you could have like a heavy history of antibiotics or something. So it wasn't necessarily like lifestyle factors or something that was in your control. But I think, or again, food poisoning or other things that are not necessarily in your control. But I do think that for the majority of the time, microbiome stuff is not necessarily root causal. There's a reason that the environment became imbalanced to begin with.
Well, and you could even make the argument that the dysbiosis is still not the root cause.
Right.
That the root of the root, like you said, was the antibiotics or the food poisoning or the whatever. And, that kind of gets us into this idea of, well, I want to start with this. I think that the one that I've heard a lot is people will go to a functional medicine clinic or a naturopath and they will be told, aha, we finally know the root cause of your tummy problems or your IBS. It was this all along. And again, it's like SIBO, leaky gut, candida kind of stuff. And again, I like the way that we've always pitched it, which is even if that is true, you can't stop there. Like there are shallow roots and there are deeper roots, right? So that's maybe a better way to frame it is, yes, maybe SIBO or candida or leaky gut is a more accurate diagnosis or label for what you're dealing with clinically, but that doesn't mean that that was the root cause per se. Honestly, in my mind, there are only like 5 or 6 true root causes once you dig down deep enough.
Yeah. Well, and I think from my standpoint, where the false root causes come into play or why they've become so popular and people haven't dug deeper to a degree is that, and I know we've talked about this too, there's this attitude of all disease, all issues start with the microbiome or the gut.
All disease begins with the gut.
Okay,
right. Hippocrates.
And again, I think that there is a lot of evidence to support that, okay, once the gut becomes imbalanced, it can lead to disease, but why did the gut become imbalanced to begin with is the key question. And so, yeah, I think because there's such a hard focus and an unwavering focus on the microbiome in the functional medicine space, I think it leads people to stop there. Like, this is just it. This is my issue. I have a microbiome issue, and that's that.
I found the root cause. Right? Like, this is it. And that is probably my biggest beef with this. I don't intrinsically have a problem with, like, the verbiage difference between, like, if somebody has had IBS for years, and then they go to a functional doctor, and they get diagnosed with candida or SIBO, and let's just assume for a moment that the testing is accurate, which it's not, and that the diagnosis is accurate, which it probably isn't. But let's just pretend in an ideal world, like that's all well and good. But again, you need to ask the questions and dig deeper and say, okay, if this person has SIBO, why did they develop SIBO? And I've joked about this for years on this podcast. It's not like your body just decided some random Tuesday, you know what would be really fun? Having bacterial overgrowth in my small intestine. That sounds like a great time. That's not how it works. Something had to happen to the body, a root cause, a trigger, if you will, had to trigger the condition that is oftentimes being proposed to be a root cause.
Right.
Hashimoto's is another one.
Well, and I think that, again, it's everyone likes a linear, very tight hypotheses, or I feel like everyone likes that linear process of like, oh, the microbiome is causing the issues, or these really tight connecting the dots type scenario. And I think you can still connect the dots, like, but you might have to continue to connect them, and it might not be as linear as you think. And I don't think it has to be linear either. Like, I think that there's different mechanisms and different things that play into things too. It's going to be hard to determine sometimes how much diet plays into things, or stress, like what percentage of the equation is that, or what percentage of the equation is lack of movement, or like, some of these other factors that I think play a role in how the environment functions. So again, I don't necessarily think we always have to have a really, really dialed in understanding of like what our exact percentage of each factor is. I think you can kind of cover a number of bases, and you're going to be covering enough of the root causes to where you're going to improve. The idea that you have to have this like completely clear picture of like, this is my number one problem, this is my number two problem, this is my number three problem. It's like, you might not get that clarity per se, but you will know, like, I think typically we'll want to know what factors are at play, and sometimes you can determine like, this is a bigger factor for you and this might be a smaller factor. But it's hard when all of them sort of interact too. Like, nutrition interacts with sleep. Sleep interacts with nutrition. Movement's going to affect how much nutrition you're going to need. Movement could affect sleep. Movement can affect stress. Like, all these things kind of interact. So it is sometimes hard to isolate like one factor or one thing. And I think that gets people into trouble too, because they want to find that one clear, without a doubt thing. And I don't really think that exists for most people.
Well, and we brought this up, and I'll kick it to you to elaborate, because I think you've talked about this more than me, but the idea of, instead of a singular diagnosis or a singular root cause, what we typically see is that it's a pie chart, and there are different sized slices, right? And like different priorities within that pie chart.
Yeah. Well, again, I think that, it takes a bit of experimenting to a degree, where if you know that you need to tweak some things nutritionally, and you try some things nutritionally, and you do get some improvements, but maybe not as far as you would like to go. Maybe movement for you is like just so amazing. Like, it helps your gut function so much better, even better than other factors. It doesn't necessarily mean the other variables aren't important too, but maybe if you kind of cover them mostly, you don't have to kind of be, I don't think anyone really has to be perfect, but you're covering them enough. Whereas other factors might need to be more emphasized in order to get more benefits. So I do think people have, differences there, and maybe movement has been lacking for a while, and nutrition seems somewhat adequate, so it makes sense to focus there. I think a lot of people too struggle a lot with things like stress and anxiety. I think the anxiety piece in particular is hard, or like mental health stuff's hard, just because I think that there tends to be a lot of resistance acknowledging that maybe there's a psychological part of the equation. And, as someone that has anxiety, and looking back knows it was such a huge part of some of the stuff that was going on with me back in my journey, I think it can be really tricky. I think I did not think that there was a psychological component, but looking back, I totally was hypervigilant. I got so sucked in that I wasn't able to live my life and things like that. But yeah, I mean, I think that there's a number of factors that, because there's these big fancy diagnoses, it sometimes leads us astray, or gives us a way to be like, ooh, I don't want to look necessarily at the psychological aspects. I'd rather look at maybe the microbiome. This seems like a better avenue to go down. And there could still be microbiome issues. So I'm not saying that that's could not be at play. But again, maybe the deeper seated issue is that there's some neurological patterns that are not going to serve you well. And working on those might be the most helpful. Alongside maybe some microbiome stuff. I'm not saying that you don't do any of those things, but I think a lot of times people are just kind of focusing on what you're saying, like the lower, the more shallow roots and not the deeper roots.
Yeah. And I think you summed it up really well. And like I said, I think there's only really like 5 or perhaps 6 true deep roots that we're dealing with. And we'll talk about those in a minute. But you're right. I think that a lot of the deeper roots, the real roots, are less appealing and more challenging to work on. Like if you had the choice of dealing with your mental bullshit or taking some antimicrobials, like, antimicrobials are so much more effective. Or if you had a choice of working on your unhappy marriage or having some tough conversations with a spouse who really stresses you out versus doing a candida diet for a couple of months, it's kind of a no-brainer for a lot of people. But again, it's like labeling these things as root causes or telling patients that these are the root causes kind of gives permission to stop there and get this really shallow kind of dive. And the thing is, that's not going to get people better for the rest of their life. Maybe you can help somebody feel better with like a low FODMAP diet or a candida diet. Maybe you can help somebody feel better for like a couple of months. But what happens when that person goes back out into the wild and lives their real actual life and has to go to work and school and weddings and, live.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, like a lot of the approaches to, I think, the true root causes in the functional medicine space or more the holistic space too are disordered in ways. Like, okay, you can focus on diet, but it's all about restricting or like perfecting or, being low FODMAP long term. Like it's sort of masquerading as covering maybe the root of like, oh, we're optimizing nutrition, but you're really not optimizing nutrition. You're just sort of restricting to help the symptoms. Or again, like I think that sometimes they'll address stuff like sort of more surface level, even from the roots of the roots. I think again, like saying you're really covering nutrition or my diet's, I'll talk to people too, and they're like, I think my diet's really sufficient and I think I'm doing a great job. And I think, again, maybe they're following exactly what the provider has said or what they think's best, but it's really not optimized at all. They're missing, they have big nutrient gaps that need to be filled. Well, so yeah, it's tricky, even though like the roots of the roots sometimes seem like they're being covered to some degree, but a lot of times it's still like missing the mark.
I'm really glad that you brought that up, actually, because I could give another few examples. So you mentioned sleep, for example. Very frequently, functional medicine or naturopathic providers will tell their patients, oh, I see that you have bad sleep. Here's my favorite supplement for sleep, right? Like, or or herb or tea or whatever. And while that can help a bit, again, like what happens if that product goes on back order and you can't get that fancy schmancy proprietary blend from Zymogen anymore? Right. It's like, and oftentimes what happens is these well-intentioned providers and, the internet at large gets caught up in sort of a version of what's called green allopathy, where they're not prescribing prescription medications for your ailments, but they are prescribing like proprietary supplement products for your ailments. And so you walk out with this like polypharmacy situation where you're on a million different herbs and supplements. Meanwhile, oftentimes there's only lip service paid to something like sleep hygiene, screen time, like mindfulness, this sort of stuff. So it's like, okay, this provider is helping you with your sleep, but only at the surface level. And maybe they gave you a handout on like 10 tips for a good night's sleep, but are they actually talking to you and verifying that you are doing those things? I've given patients handouts many times, and then I find out way later that they're not actually following a damn thing on the handout. Right? But that's what happens.
Well, and again, I think that a lot of practitioners, and I've probably been here historically too at times, I think there's an underestimation of how hard it is to change habits. And so it's like, oh, I might know exactly what to do, but actually implementing this could be really difficult. Or I'm struggling with certain barriers, or I'm getting this handout that seems way beyond where I'm at. I'm getting this handout that's saying I need to be sleeping 8 hours a day, but I'm sleeping 5.5, and I need to be doing all these things that just seem like way beyond where I'm at. So I'm just going to give up. So
it's like overwhelm paralysis.
Right. I think there's a lot of situations like that in the wellness space where it's almost like, oh, this seems like too big of an issue. I'm going to kind of like ignore it or just accept that that's where it's at.
Or supplement around it.
Right. Or supplement around it. When I think in reality, what most people need is coaching around habits, or just someone that can keep them accountable or give them a suggestion that helps them move them towards where they need to be. Because again, if you're sleeping 6 hours a night, it's probably unrealistic to set a goal to sleep 8 hours a night right out the gate. Like, why don't we try to get you like an extra half an hour, 45 minutes of sleep? How do we make that work as an intermediate goal and slowly build you towards a longer goal? I think that gets really lost in the functional space too. And I think it impacts someone's ability to really truly address some of these root causes fully, because sometimes there's bigger gaps and they just need more coaching on how to change habits, which isn't easy.
And I think you hit something that I want to touch on, which is this idea of coaching. So first of all, I think this is correct about your business, but I could be wrong. You don't do single appointment sessions, right? Like you work with people for some chunk of time, typically.
Right. Correct.
Yeah, so do I. And sometimes people get annoyed with that. They think, oh, I just need one appointment. And I think what could happen is a lot of people have come to believe that they just need the correct diagnosis and the correct protocol. And then magically everybody's going to be farting unicorns and butterflies after that. And what ends up happening is like, even if I could correctly diagnose you and tell you the exact protocol you need to follow in that one appointment, which by the way is a huge ask for any provider.
Right.
Even if I could do that, your ability to take that information and actually execute it in your day-to-day life effectively to the point where you get symptomatic resolution, and your ability to like troubleshoot things that come up is probably more limited than you realize. And that's where we get into, really, I see my role much more as a coach these days rather than the diagnostician. I'm not telling people what's wrong with them so much anymore. I'm really just coaching them on how do they start to implement this stuff that could be really tricky. How do you get more thiamine in your diet?
Right.
How do you increase your calories if you've been under eating for so long? How do you improve your sleep or kind of work around like some relationship or some work stress so that your body can cope with it in a healthier way? Like, and those things take time. They take coaching and accountability and some knowledge of like behavior change and psychology. And it's really messy. And that's where the magic happens, quite frankly. It's not going to be one session.
Yeah. And I agree. I think the coaching element too comes really into play about prioritizing certain things. Like, okay, maybe your sleep needs a lot of work, your nutrition needs a lot of work, your stress management maybe you need a lot of work in certain areas. It's like, well, it can feel really overwhelming to be like, I want to work on the unsexy basics, but I have so much going on. Like, what should I start with first?
Yeah.
And I think there's usually like, sometimes I'll mix it up based on the person. Like maybe stress is just insanely high and you have to kind of focus in on that first. But usually there's a general process that I think works most of the time. where like if sleep's really off, if there's kind of certain patterns, I might focus on nutrition first and see how it affects sleep. So yeah, I mean, I think that being able to prioritize things is super important too. And I think a coach can help you, be able to say, okay, let's table this to later and like really focus on getting better at this. And then we can move on to that. But if you're trying to establish all these habits at one time, it's probably not going to pan out as well. I know we might have talked about this in a habits episode recently. I think when doing research for my book, like the absolute maximum habits, a lot of the habit experts say that you can do at one time is 3. You can't build more than 3 habits at one time. And they said if you're going to do 3, make them small, not like big. If you're changing a big habit, you might want to stick to like one thing at a time and kind of establish it as a habit and then add in another habit once it feels like it's pretty ingrained.
Well, I will throw a caveat into the mix though, because I do think some of our listeners could change multiple habits all at once. And I'll give this as an option. So if you're feeling like you want to be an overachiever and you want to change more things, like say if you're listening and you know darn well you need to work on nutrition and sleep and movement and mindset and stress, what I'm going to prescribe right now, I'm going to get out my magic fairy wand. And you, listener, who identifies with this part of the conversation, you now get to magically quit your job and leave behind all of your ties to this existence. Now your life is just going to be laying around on a beach or a mountain, creek, whichever you jive with, but you get to just go escape and exist in some vacation destination. You can choose to leave your family or bring your family with you. You don't have to work anymore. You don't have to worry about money anymore. In that sort of situation where you have a complete and total once in a lifetime overhaul of your life, by all means, change all the things at once. But shy of doing that, assuming that you still have mostly the same relationships, mostly the same like job and money kind of stressors, the same environment, like the same house, town, country, whatever, assuming that most of the rest of your life is not changing, I agree. I think you're probably better off working on 1 or 2 or maybe 3 things for, a quarter of the year and tackling things that way. Right. And I think you're right. I think that figuring out what to prioritize is a really huge part for a lot of people. It's like you could Google yourself into oblivion and you could see, I have all the symptoms of estrogen dominance. I have all the symptoms of histamine intolerance. I have all of the symptoms of insomnia. I have all the symptoms of leaky gut. Oh my God, my nutrition. Oh my God, I haven't moved in decades. Oh my God. And you could very quickly and easily give yourself a list of a bajillion different things that you think you need to work on, but you can't possibly work on all of those things at once. And to toot my own horn slightly, this is one of the things that I'm really proud of with FODMAP Freedom is that that's like baked into the program is this continual reinforcement of a reminder of, okay, here's how you prioritize things. So if you get to a point with that program where you have like 6 things you think you might have going on, I have that baked in right from the beginning of, okay, here's how you prioritize it. If you have 6 different things, you defer to this one. And then we have the coaching sessions and the Q&As so that we can help you kind of noodle on it a little bit in that sense too. But it's really important because otherwise you get in these situations that we've seen before where people are taking 3 supplements for estrogen dominance, 4 supplements for histamine intolerance, 3 supplements for leaky gut, 2 supplements for candida, 2 supplements for SIBO, 2 vitamins, a B complex, a sleep herb, an adaptogen, and they're taking like 20 capsules of shit 3 times a day. And it's no wonder you're not feeling better. Your body is so confused when you do it that way versus if you could treat things in the right order, you could maybe pare that down to like 3 or 4 supplements. Maybe.
Yeah. And I think it all comes down to having a long-term sustainable mindset as well. I've just had a conversation with a newer client about this yesterday, and it was a really nice conversation because again, it was like how you approach getting better too is going to really frame your experience in different ways, and it's really going to affect your decision making. And so I think if you're in this mindset of, oh, I can get better in this amount of time, and like I need to get better sooner rather than later, and like I need to rush this, like I think there's a rushing mentality, because if you don't feel good, I can imagine feeling like you need to. I know I was in an urgent state during my gut journey, so like I was not beyond this. This was something that was totally part of my journey too, where I felt, ooh, I need to be better by this date because there's a wedding and I want to make sure that I'm doing well at the wedding, and maybe I can drink a little bit and eat the food. And it's like you set these I don't know, timelines on yourself that create a lot of pressure. Deadlines. Yes. These deadlines. And I think, again, like our culture naturally does that. We have direct to consumer advertising for drugs and pharmaceuticals that make it seem like, oh, there is like a quicker fix to things. I think we're already
too. I see a lot of ads for supplements on Instagram and Facebook.
For sure. So again, I think that there's definitely like a quick fix mentality. And I think we're maybe wired to want quick fixes anyway, but then just culturally we're surrounded by it. So it makes it tricky to approach this from like a the roots scenario, because none of those things can really be corrected in a day or two or a week or a month, or like, again, there's not really a timeline for it. Usually a lot of the root causal work takes a bit of time, and you don't want to put tons of pressure on outcomes while you're working on some of these root causal areas.
Well, and I think that I could draw a parallel here with an area of healthcare that a fair amount of people are familiar with. It's like weight loss, right?
Yeah.
Let's say that somebody was hoping to lose 100 pounds. So like a more ambitious amount of weight loss. Well, if you try to lose all of the 100 pounds in like 6 months with a crash diet or a metafast or, something unsustainable, I guarantee you, without a shadow of a doubt in my mind, you will gain all of it back and then some, probably within the calendar year. And that is well supported in the research that happens. But if you take a person who says, hey, I have 100 pounds to lose, I'm being realistic, I understand that I didn't gain all this weight overnight, and I need to be mindful of like what my body can handle, taking on a stressor like weight loss, and I'm going to do it the right way. And if somebody is in that mindset and they are going gradually, right? Like maybe they're only cutting back 300 calories a day, and they're working out and they're eating a bit cleaner, and maybe they're doing other things like therapy or whatever. I think that the person could lose 100 pounds over the course of 2 years, and which is actually still like quite a lot of weight loss for that amount of time, if you think about it. But losing that same amount of weight, but spreading it out over 2 years and understanding what the journey looks like and understanding what's realistic and reasonable to expect your body to do. And knowing, oh, I don't want to just lose this weight for a couple of months and then gain it back. I want to lose this weight and keep it off for the rest of my life. Like, again, it's that long-term mentality that will kind of keep your eye on the prize even when the going gets tough. But again, if you're in that position where you're like, my sister's getting married in 6 months, so I have to drop 100 pounds so I fit in this dress that I bought that is totally not my size, and like, I need to do extreme things and go to all of like the laser liposuction, slim and trim med spas in the area, and I need to starve myself. Like, even if you achieve your goal temporarily, it's only going to be temporary. And I feel like that's the same with this world. It's like you could go for the quick fix, so to speak, of an antibiotic like rifaximin, or an antimicrobial, or a leaky gut patcher-upper, or taking valerian to knock yourself out at night so that you get some sleep, or taking some melatonin so it knocks your ass out to get some sleep at night. Like, is that really a long-term sustainable solution, or is it going to backfire in your face at some point? I don't know. And I'm not questioning the safety of those particular two supplements, by the way, but I think the analogy still stands.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And again, like I think it's one thing to use maybe some support while you're working on the deep-seated stuff, but to just say like, oh, let's slap some valerian on it and ride it out instead of being like, oh, let's look at your hygiene, your daily patterns. Like, are you getting sun? Or what's your nighttime routine look like? How much are you eating? Like
the lifestyle stuff.
Does movement stuff, like for me, like I have some nuancy stuff with sleep too, where like if I work out too late, sometimes I'm like too amped up to go to bed. Like I would notice that sometimes when I played tennis, that was like the only time I could play was in the evening. It would take me a minute for like the adrenaline stuff from playing to wear down.
I feel like that's pretty normal.
Yeah. So again, like there's sometimes just like having conversations and understanding like what the current barriers are, so that you can chip away at them is going to be the most important piece. The valerian's just a supportive piece while you're working on those things.
Totally. And I've said this for a while also. Take the example that's near and dear to the IBS and SIBO world, which is motility. We could use a cheat code, so to speak, and we could help you get better motility fairly quickly with a prokinetic, but the prokinetics are not going to heal you. You don't have a motility problem or you don't have SIBO or bloating because you have a deficiency in prokinetics.
Right.
But it's like, it's like a cheat code for a video game. We can help you level up a little bit sooner than you otherwise would have, but you still need to play the actual video game and you need to, I'm actually not a video game person, so I'm running on this and I have no idea what I'm talking about, but like you still need to collect the trinkets and the swords and the HP or the EP or I don't know what the life coins. I don't know, man, but you get the idea. You still have to play the actual game and get to the finish line on your own. It's just, do you level up a little bit sooner or a little bit later? And that's how I see prokinetics. And I tell my students this almost every week after we learn about this in FODMAP Freedom. It's like, the prokinetics aren't healing shit. What you actually need to do if you want good motility for the rest of your life is start looking back at your relationship with food. Look at things like blood sugar and blood flow and things that would affect nervous system health, maybe movement. Start thinking about like how you're digesting and processing your food. So stomach acid, bile, chewing, just chew your damn food, experience your damn food. And that goes a long way. But and then vagus nerve stuff, like is your vagus nerve getting signals for safety and connectedness? If not, you need to work on that in order to have good motility. But again, these things don't happen overnight. You don't go from being a recluse, or as one of my FODMAP Freedom students recently confessed, he had turned into a hermit because of all of his SIBO stuff, and he got really anxious and paranoid and scared, and he was Googling himself into oblivion. You don't go from that life to like Mr. Social Butterfly Man overnight. You're not going to do that. You have to kind of come back out of your shell gradually. Or if you have felt unsafe, either in your physical environment or unsafe in your body for a long time, you can't just flip a switch and tell your vagus nerve, oh, BTW, we're safe now. We're good. And then magically have good motility. So that's where something like the prokinetics come in, or like betaine HCl or bile support. It's not that you need that forever. It's not that that's intrinsically going to heal you, but it does help manage some symptoms and help you level up, so to speak, a little bit sooner than you would, which buys you some time and some wherewithal to actually work on what matters.
Right.
But you still have to do the latter part of it, right? Like you still have to work on what matters.
Right. I often think about that when it comes to just leveling up on nutrition, in particular with digestive aids. It's like, if you're really struggling to get intake up because of your symptoms, like doing digestive aids can be great in order to achieve that goal. But to me, the goal is, yes, to lower symptoms in the moment, but ultimately to get your nutrition where it needs to be so you can have long-term success. So then you don't need all these supports. Like you're saying, it's like it's a Band-Aid. It's a very helpful Band-Aid so that the process can go smoother.
Yeah.
It's not something that you need forever.
Another metaphor that I've painted before for people is it's kind of like a crutch. If you break a leg, it would be the right thing to do, the compassionate thing to do, to offer you a crutch so that you can take some pressure off that leg.
Yeah.
But is the crutch actually healing you? No. Time? You could argue nutrition is healing you because you're bringing nutrients to the site to repair the tissues. You know, maybe you're going to physical therapy. Maybe you're doing some stretching and mobilizing and strengthening kind of routine. Maybe you need to have surgery and you need screws or plates or something put in. But you get the idea. It's all of that other stuff that actually heals the damn leg, but it's still the right thing to do. And it's still the like best thing for symptom management to make sure that that person isn't walking on their damn broken leg. And that's where the crutch comes in. So yeah, it's I think crutches and Band-Aids and cheat codes are all valuable. It's just understanding that that's what they are is important. And a lot of people, again, get into the cycle of like, oh, I'm going to take HCl or I'm going to take an antimicrobial or glutamine or whatever. And like, that's it. Then I'm done. And then they discontinue the L-glutamine or whatever it might be. And then they feel like crap again and they're left scratching their head. That happened to me.
Well, and I think then the problem is they start assuming that they're just this difficult case of SIBO that can't be fixed instead of like, no, you have
the worst kind of bacteria and they have biofilms.
Right. Instead of what's actually happening is they're just never really correcting the core pieces that are going to help them get over the hump. Yeah. And the pieces that have been off probably from the very beginning. It's like, why did you have that dysbiosis to begin with? What breakdowns are happening in your gut-brain axis? I think is really the question to answer too. It's like, okay, that's going to cover all of these bases that we're talking about. But yeah, it's a bummer because I think it makes people more hopeless a lot of times instead of being an indicator that, ooh, I'm approaching this wrong. Yeah. Or I'm approaching this in a way that's not going to lead to long-term success. And part of the problem is, I think, the functional medicine space, everybody around you is saying, oh, how difficult SIBO is and how...
And they'll tell you to your face, oh, you've already had 3 rounds of rifaximin and it came back again. Wow, you're a really tough case. Or, oh, this is a high relapse condition. So yeah, the functional medicine space is absolutely filling people's heads with nonsense.
Right.
But I like that you brought up the idea of an indicator. Like, oh, the fact that you've tried something this many times and it keeps coming back or it keeps failing you somehow should be an indicator light that something's amiss or you're missing something. Right. And again, when I say that, see, people make that assumption and they figure, oh, I'm missing something, but they always assume that it's another diagnosis or another thing wrong with them. That's not what I mean. I mean, like you're missing...
Or that the treatment itself, like they need stronger herbals or that they, like I said, an indicator that their SIBO was really bad and they need just more of the same.
Yeah. It's kind of like a glass half full versus glass half empty scenario. Like when people hear, if they think, oh, I must be missing something, their head goes to the worst possible case. Like, this is the most progressed case of SIBO in the entire universe. And like, it has a biofilm. And that's not what I mean. What I mean is like, you're missing something in the sense of addressing these root causes or these foundational, unsexy kind of things that we're talking about. But here's another picture to paint. I hope our audience loves metaphors and analogies because we always paint like 32 of them per episode. And I feel like this is how I like to learn and this is how I like to teach. So I just pray that people dig that. But I was going to share, at the risk of this being a little bit embarrassing for my dad has had 2 instances where I don't think he gets cars or he's like really cheap with his car. So there was one time where his car clearly had a problem with the tire and he was putting air in the tire every single day. Like before he drove the car, every single time he would put more air in the tire. And he did this for like months before he broke down and got new tires. Now, okay, is it smarter and more root causal for him to just get new tires? Absolutely. but it's unappealing because tires are expensive. So if you're trying to be a
Right.
cheapskate or you're trying to avoid that difficult thing, you could Band-Aid it by putting air in the tire every day. But again, it's like you put air in the tire the first time and then you come back out to your car the next morning and the tire is flat. You should be going, maybe there's still a hole. Maybe I'm missing something. And again, my dad just ignored that and was like, whatever. And he just kept filling it up. He did the same thing with oil at one point, which is worse in my opinion. But at one point, he was adding oil to his vehicle every single time he drove it. And it's like, shouldn't you maybe bring it to the mechanic?
Right.
Isn't that kind of red flaggy to you? But again, he's so cheap. He refuses to do anything with this car. It's a miracle that it's still rolling down the road. But similarly, you put oil in the first time and you're like, oh, it's low on oil. It must just need oil, whatever. You put it in the first time. Cool, you're good. But then when you come back, a week later and you're low on oil again, what should happen is you should think, I must have a leak somewhere. I need to get this fixed. And then you get your car into the damn mechanic. But again, that doesn't oftentimes happen here. But it may be enough with the metaphors and analogies. Should we finally, 41 minutes into the episode, reveal what would you consider to be real roots, like the deepest of the deepest of the deep roots, Amy? These 5 or maybe 6 that I set forth. You want to rattle off a couple and then I'll do the other few?
Yeah. I mean, we've definitely been alluding to them throughout. So it's not like we've been totally keeping you hanging. But I mean, for me, what's been so fun about doing my book is the total deep dive on nutrition and gut function. And I think thinking of it through the lens of what do you need to digest well? You need your gut-brain axis to be healthy and functioning optimally. Well, what does that need? Nutrition is such a huge piece because it nourishes the nervous system. It's going to be critical for making digestive juices like enzymes and stomach acid and bile. It's going to be important for blood flow. It's going to be important for pretty much everything. Energy production so that we can make things. It's just critical across the board. Immune function. You need it for everything.
Hormones.
Really. Right. Everything you need nutrition. And again, it gets so flipped upside down in the holistic space where instead of really focusing on ensuring that you're really well nourished so that your gut can function optimally and your body as a whole can function optimally, it gets more, we focus much more on symptom management strategies from a dietary standpoint. So low FODMAP or restriction. And it's actually the opposite of what we probably need to be doing. Now, some restriction might make sense if you just really can't tolerate certain things, but the level, right, the level to which the level of which I see restriction in the holistic space is way too much. And it impacts nutrition. And so we should be flipping it back to where nutrition's really the highest priority. And if it's not, that's going to be a problem. But again, I'm mind blown if you look at each nutrient, even beyond the macronutrients. So we need calories, we need carbs, we need protein, we need fat. But if you look at individual micronutrients, I don't think I found one nutrient where there isn't some link to gut function. So if your nutrition's so compromised, and a lot of people have outright deficiencies too. I mean, how often do you see low ferritin? I was trying to decide on maybe what percentage, just off the top of my head, I see low ferritin, but it's really common, especially for women.
Yeah.
But you start having people that develop deficiencies. I think the general population is already prone to deficiencies because the standard American diet's not great. So if you have gut issues and then you're kind of coming from a more standard American diet, maybe you try to eat healthy, but it's still not necessarily optimized. Then you kind of go low FODMAP. So you might have had some gaps already. Then you go low FODMAP and your gaps continue to expand. And nutrition just gets totally decimated, I feel like, in this holistic space. And then it's really hard to come out of. I really think the nutrition piece is such a core root causal piece that a lot of people are just not covering. And it's hard for people to grasp that, I think, once they're really deep into the restrictive side, because they feel like they can't get out of it. Like they're so restrictive that it feels like it's really challenging to add stuff back in, or scary, or like they get more food fear stuff going on that can be hard to overcome. But I think, again, it's going to be really hard. It's going to be impossible to solve gut issues if your nutrition's compromised, like I see with a lot of my patients.
Yeah, I think that was beautifully said. I'll throw this out there too, that if you're walking around with a whole bunch of deficiencies potentially, or at bare minimum insufficiencies, it's kind of like all hats are off, right? So
yeah,
you're going to have a really hard time understanding pattern recognition and like understanding patterns in your symptoms, understanding patterns with your lab work, and like really putting together the pieces of a puzzle if your vision of the puzzle is clouded by a million different weird nutritional deficiencies.
Yeah.
And even really recently, I don't remember if I told you this, this was a couple days ago, one of my patients, we're plucking away at stuff, but she came to our most recent appointment dead set she has a hormone problem. And I'll confess, I'm not really the big hormone person. In my opinion, hormones are almost always a downstream consequence of these deeper roots, so to speak. So if you just focus on the deep roots, the hormone problems generally go away. So we had a conversation, and basically the second half of her cycle sucks very badly. Like luteal phase, just everything is a million times worse. And, she was pretty dead set on this, and we've had some difficulties with like managing stuff up until this point. So I said, okay, uncle, we could do a little bit of hormone testing and we could take a stab at this, and like, what the hell, let's do it. And I had to chuckle about it after the fact because if I'm really being honest, if I'm being a good clinician and a good coach, I should not have let the patient dictate what happens to that degree, right? Like there's a fine line between listening to your patient and being open-minded and empathetic and being a good listener versus letting them steer the ship and let them decide what needs to happen clinically. Like those are two different things.
Right.
And so I felt a little bit weird about it, but again, I'm like, all right, if this makes you happy, whatever, we could do some hormone testing. But then I've been slowly working my way through Sarah Ballantyne's book, Nutrivore, which is excellent, by the way, total plug to her. But I got to the mineral section and she had a whole bunch of information about calcium and how low calcium intake is tied with PMS symptoms. And calcium supplementation has been shown in several studies to reduce PMS symptoms. And there was this whole interplay in the book about like, it's affecting serotonin and estrogen in a way. And anyway, and I had to laugh because this particular patient, I've been really preaching to her, you need to eat more. We need to diversify. Like you're low in so many vitamins and minerals. Holy crap. You're not going to you can't fuel yourself like this. And she's been very resistant to this conversation. Well, lo and behold, I went and I exported a report out of her chronometer. And for the days that she logged in the last 2 months, she has consumed an average of 24% of her daily value of calcium.
Yeah.
Right. Is this it? I mean, time will tell. I gave her this information. We're going to see if she runs with it, right? You can lead a horse to water. You can't make him drink. And the studies that looked at this did give calcium supplementation for, I believe it was 3 months. So it's not a quick fix by any stretch. But, like here we kind of circle back to something really unsexy and really basic. Freaking calcium saves the day potentially. So, it's like, does this patient truly have a hormone problem? Or is she just ragingly calcium deficient?
Right. Does she have an intake problem?
Yeah.
That's leading to the hormone problem.
Yeah. Or at least symptoms of a hormone problem.
Well, and I think I see this too. similar to what you're saying with patients where they'll say, well, I tried to do that and it didn't help. But when you look at when you look at them at that point in time, their nutrition was was deficient. They might have been under eating and losing weight. And if that's happening, it's like your baseline's so far off from being optimized that it's really hard to discern what's going on. Like you were saying before, it's really hard to understand like what's doing what when you're that deficient and depleted.
Yeah.
And so I find like a lot of people in the SIBO journey, if you talk to them, they're like, okay, I went really restrictive and lost a bunch of weight and nothing worked. And it's like, well, the fact that you were losing weight shows me that your body was super stressed and not having the resources it needs. So like that in and of itself could be causing more symptoms than it's solving.
Yeah. But well, if you think too, sorry to interrupt you, but what is it they say that magnesium is needed for like 300 different reactions in the body or 300 different enzymes in the body? So that's an example of just one single nutrient deficiency. If you are deficient in it, Lord knows how it's affecting your body. And again, all hats are off. You just don't know. And now you stack that with potentially multiple deficiencies over an extended period of time. I agree. I think that this is probably the most foundational of the roots that we see. And again, sometimes it's a really hard sell to get people to get back to this because, bless their hearts, they've gone to like functional medicine people and naturopaths and they've had food sensitivity testing. Maybe they went to like the antioxalate provider who told them that spinach is evil. They've been told food is medicine, but then given a huge elimination diet. It's complicated when you get into that world.
It really is. I think again, there's the level of like fear and confusion makes it hard to sort of see some of these things that are, I think, makes so much sense on their face, but the fear sort of comes in.
Yeah.
Or again, symptoms or things that kind of prevent you from doing it. And again, I just think some of the holistic dietary advice and nutritional dogma also makes it hard. Because again, if you have it in your head that like certain foods are just inherently really bad and you're already like limiting yourself to a degree, it's going to be hard to replete with some of the beliefs you might have. So the nutrition piece, I just can't. It's probably beating the deadest of horses at this at this point. We are beating the deadest of horses. But again, like I feel like we have to scream till we're blue in the face because again, people typically are not prioritizing it as much as I'm still seeing people coming to me where nutrition is not anywhere close to where it needs to be.
Oh yeah. I get people who go through all 12 modules of FODMAP Freedom, and then I ask them after the fact, I'm like, so what did you see when you did chronometer tracking, which is module 1, by the way, like the first thing I teach you and I encourage you to do. And I've had so many people who are like, I didn't do chronometer. Like, bro, what are you doing, man? This is the most foundational of the foundations I can ever teach you. Like, and there's a free app you can use. Come on. It can't be easier than this. But yeah, I think that was a great lead in. I'll throw out 2 in there. So we had already talked quite a bit about sleep, right? So that is probably a gimme. Think about your brain and everything it controls. And now all of those things are going to go out the window if you're not sleeping.
Yeah.
So I don't care if you're talking about stomach acid production, bioflow, healing your leaky gut, MMC, motility kind of stuff, peristalsis, muscle contraction, hormone production, immune signaling, literally everything in the body is controlled by the brain at the end of the day. So if your brain is PO'd because you're not sleeping, good luck to you. I don't know what to tell you. And again, like, for some people, it could be as simple as taking some chamomile tea, and then that's like wonderful for them. For some people, it might be that they need a sleep study and they get diagnosed with sleep apnea and they need a CPAP. I don't know, but And for an awful lot of people, it's going to be more like sleep hygiene, circadian rhythm, sunlight during the day kind of stuff. But sleep is huge. I'll throw out another one, if I may, being mindful of our time here. But I think infections as a broad category could be another true root cause.
Right.
Right? Because if you think under the framework we proposed in the beginning of like, well, your body just doesn't decide to get SIBO. Something had to cause the SIBO for that to happen. Right. Not necessarily true for infectious disease. Right? You get exposed, and then that is the root cause, is just the exposure. Like you get bit by a tick, you're exposed to Lyme disease, boom, you get this infection. Or you're exposed to a staph bacteria, boom, you get an infection. There's a little bit more nuance to that because there's also this conversation of like resiliency and immune activity. So apparently they did this study like 100 years ago, and it's totally not ethical. They would never do it now. But I heard this at a conference years ago that they did a study where they took nasal secretions from somebody with confirmed flu, and they took that on like a Q-tip and they stuck it in the nose of a bunch of healthy, normal people. And then they just watched and waited to see who would get the flu. And not all of those people got the flu.
Yeah.
So it begs this question, like, I'm kind of modeling this a little bit incorrectly for the sake of simplicity. There's the exposure piece of it, but for a lot of infections, there is this question of immune resiliency, immune strength. And again, a lot of that could just boil down to nutrition as an easy example. So I think infections can be, I'm still going to classify it as a root. And that would also encompass something like food poisoning or traveler's diarrhea. Or you could even just make the umbrella slightly more broad and say microbial. I hesitate to do that because, again, then we get into this conversation of like dysbiosis not being a root cause. But I don't know, like taking antibiotics is a microbial event. And I would consider antibiotic use to be a root cause of dysbiosis. So this one's a little bit funny to talk about, but I would say broadly like infectious or microbial kind of stuff could potentially be a root cause. But don't forget about things like nutrition and immune resiliency and fiber intake and like nervous system health as it relates to the exposure to the microbe. So that one's a little bit less clean, but I thought it was relevant. Do you want to share another one?
Yeah.
We've alluded to it.
We've alluded to a couple. Again, I think there's a lot of things that could lump into this category, but like stress management, mindset, anxiety, mental health stuff, all that kind of wraps up in like maybe how your nervous system is wired and functioning to a degree. And there's a lot under that umbrella, I guess, too, to unpack when it comes to like stress, like mental, emotional stressors, mental health stuff, work-life balance, relationships, all that stuff kind of falls under that umbrella, in my opinion. But I just think, again, if the simplest way for me to think about root causes is boiling down to like what affects the gut-brain axis to any major degree. And again, stress in general is going to play a major role in dysregulating that axis and making it hard for it to communicate efficiently. So, I think the stress piece is huge, and there's different facets of that. And you might need to focus on maybe like you don't necessarily have tons of stress, like psychological stress, but you need to focus on joy and pleasure. Like you're just kind of like feeling, I've had patients like that where it's like, okay, I don't really have necessarily a stressful life, but I'm also feel like I could use more like joy and pleasure and focus more on that. Other people have much more like hypervigilance, anxiety type neurological patterns that I see where they have more like food fear stuff they have to work through. And then other people, again, I think there's work-life balance stuff. Maybe they need to find a different job or
relationships.
Again, there's a lot of different facets of stress, and just kind of being able to look at it in an unbiased way and being sort of honest with where you're at, and compassionate for where you're at with some of these things. I think sometimes there can be a level of judgment with like, oh, maybe your stress tolerance is lower than someone else, or maybe you're struggling with anxiety. I think sometimes there can be a little bit more judgment.
I literally just had this conversation. I think it was a FODMAP Freedom student. No, it might have been a patient. I forget. But I just had this conversation with somebody about, well, I don't know if my trauma is playing that big of a role. And she literally told me, because I compare myself to my friend, let's call her Chelsea. And Chelsea has had way worse trauma than me, but she doesn't have bloating.
Right.
But I do. So like my trauma must not be it. And it's like the stories we spin in
right.
our brains to avoid this topic just astonish me. And, you know, to be quite frank, I had a patient maybe a year or two ago. She got very butthurt when I gently, compassionately brought up the role of stress and mental health in her journey. And she wrote me this big long letter and put it in the patient portal. And she told me point blank that she is still willing to work with me if I promise to never bring up stress again. And she said she was surprised that I would even say this because that's based on 20-year-old research. And I laughed and said, I cannot make that promise.
Right.
It is way too important and it affects so much.
Right.
I would be doing you a disservice if I didn't ever bring it up again. And also the fact that you're responding that way and you're so triggered by this means I was right all along.
Right. Like the level of denial and like closing off from the conversation, that's sometimes too. I don't know if I feel like I've heard maybe a psychology profiles on Instagram or something talk about this, but like usually the things that somewhat trigger you, there's some degree of truth that maybe, or curiosity Absolutely. You should go into a little bit. If you are really like, if we were having a conversation and you were my patient and I brought up stress and you're like, but it's not stress, and like you're physically stressed talking about it, it would be more of an indicator to me that you are 100% inherently stressed. Like it does seem
it's a tell.
Right. And sometimes, again, it's very easy to spot at this point when someone is in a bit of denial because, again, a lot of their demeanor, their answers to questions, just talking to them, you can see the stress in their responses, in everything they're doing. So again, it's hard to hide, I think, from us at this point because we see it. And again, I think just inherently understanding that stress is a factor for everybody. What parts you might need to work on compared to someone else might be different. But, you know, I would assume pretty much all my patients, it'd be really rare for there not to be a stress component or something that we're working on within that realm.
Well, and here's something I've shared before maybe is that I was joking before the pandemic even that we all need to be on adaptogens because
right.
life on Earth is just weird and stressful and chaotic and
right.
unpredictable. And then the pandemic happened and I was like, oh, okay, we all need a double dose of adaptogens now. So it's like, I don't care what life you live. I'm sure you all have some sort of stress. And unless, okay, there's one exception. There's one type of person who might be listening to our podcast and they have my full permission to ignore the stress mental health conversation. You ready for this?
Yes.
If you are a Buddhist monk sitting on a damn mountain in damn Tibet right now, you have my permission to ignore this part of the conversation. Everybody else, and by the way, like a Buddhist monk in Tibet on a mountain, probably not listening to a podcast right now anyway.
If they are, it'd be kind of fun to have them on. So
that'd be amazing, actually. There is an Instagram guy who used to be a monk, I think, and he puts out really cool information, so he might be a good guest. But anyway, my point is, if you're living in the normal world like us, you probably would benefit from working on your stress or mental health or mental bullshit in some way. It's just what that looks like for you is your own journey. For some people, it might be an adaptogen like ashwagandha. For some people, bringing more joy into their life. For some people, it might be getting a divorce or getting a new job. For some people, it might be like taking more time off and going on a vacation every now and then. For some people, it might be doing psychedelics. I don't know. You do you. But either way, if you're listening right now, you probably need to care about this a little bit more than you currently do. Starting to wind up, though. I'll take one more and then I'll throw one more to you for root causes, and then we should start to wrap up here. I will also say, in a similar vein to the infection model that I proposed of like the exposure to the microbe itself is the trigger, and therefore I would generally call that a root cause still. Another one that you could also say is toxicity.
Yeah.
And I'm picturing, let's go with the most outrageous version of this. I don't know if just using a Teflon nonstick pan in your teen years is enough to trigger a ton. Like, we're still understanding this. But certainly the bigger exposures, like if you find out that you have black mold in your living environment or your work environment, or if you, heaven forbid, live in Flint, Michigan, and you found out that there's high amounts of lead in the water, or like I read a case not that long ago about a woman who got overt mercury poisoning because she was using skin whitening creams, and those skin whitening creams contain mercury. And it gets absorbed through the skin. Yeah. So I think certainly the bigger levels of toxic exposure could be a root cause for people. The smaller ones and like all of the many different exposures that we get on a day-to-day, month-to-month, year-to-year basis, it's just a little bit harder to say because it's poorer studied than like these big whopping exposures. But that's another one where I would say, yeah, getting exposed to the lead in the water for those people in Flint, Michigan, like that is a root cause. There wasn't anything in their body that preceded that. It was literally just exposure. There's one more that I'll kick it to you for, because you're the one who's brought it up. Let me see how good your memory is of the episode. You mentioned it a time or two, though.
Yeah. Well, I'll mention one other thing about the toxicity situation. Like, one thing that I was going to a biological dentist. He has retired. He was great. He was sort of funny. He at one point like hated dentistry and was a yoga teacher for like 10 years and then came back to dentistry. And I was like, this is just crazy. But anyway, he was a great guy. He was in charge of some dental organization with toxicity in the name, and I forget what it was. But basically, like, he's kind of knows about mercury and fillings and things like that. And it was interesting because I think I found a video of him online talking about, or maybe it was just in conversation with him, I can't remember. But basically what he was saying was that there'll be a person that might have 8 mercury fillings and have no health issues because they can detox it more easily than someone that might have 2 fillings and have tons of issues. So he said it's kind of an interesting situation from what he's seen in terms of like fillings, because sometimes people get their fillings removed. And he's like, sometimes it makes a big difference for people and sometimes it doesn't. And so again, that's another example of like, ooh, there could be some nutrition related things that are affecting detox or genetic things affecting detox that could make it more challenging. And I know mold's like that too. They talk a little bit about that there's like a genetic predisposition to not detox mold quite as well. But yeah, I think some of the like more minor exposures or like lesser exposures that aren't like outright mold overgrowth in your home that get a little tricky, they can be a little bit more nuanced too. But I agree, the toxicity piece can certainly aggravate the gut-brain axis and inflame everything and make it really hard for things to function properly from like a cellular level. So that's a good one. I'm glad you brought that one up. And then the last one, go ahead. Were you going to say something?
Oh, I was just going to say it's very analogous to the caveats I threw in there with the infectious piece of it. Right. Where it's like, yes, the exposure to the microbe is the trigger for a lot of people, but also with most every microbe, there is a little bit of like susceptibility, resiliency conversation. And similarly, I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, like how well are you detoxing? I've seen a couple of studies where they've shown that probiotics can help you detox stuff. So if you eat fish with mercury and you consume it with a probiotic, the probiotic actually like binds up some of the mercury so that you don't absorb it and you end up pooping out the mercury.
Right.
So, even things like microbial health and nutritional diversity and microbiome diversity might play a role there. But again, I think for sure the bigger exposures, like again, whoa, your house is full of black mold, or oh, you had lead in the water. Those sorts of things.
Chewing on that paint again.
Yeah, exactly.
Nikki likes chewing on the paint chips.
I do. It's true. That's why I have all these paintings behind me, actually, because there's so many holes in the wall. Because I go to the wall and I'm like, and I just
covering up your snack.
Yeah, exactly. I get hungry a lot, guys. What can I say? But yeah, I think that was an excellent point. Kicking it to you for perhaps the last one. The last one I could think of at least.
The last one would be movement. It's physical activity, man. I think you just need to find something that you enjoy, and kind of stick to that. I don't think you want to move too much. I've seen that be problematic for some and almost be root causal for some. I see that a lot with some people that are more like weekend warrior types. And I think it could be a situation too where like when there's dysfunction already and then you're potentially like stressing the small intestine out even more with movement that's high intensity for long periods of time. Basically, it just leads to blood flow leaving the gut to the limbs, and it leads to atrophy and damage to the lining over time. Now, there's adaptations that we can do when you don't push it too hard and you have the resources to maybe recover and strengthen your gut barrier. Like there seems to be evidence of that. But I think in people that are experiencing gut symptoms, there does seem to be like this limit with how much like high intensity exercise they can do. And there's probably variability between people. So again, like some people could do it and be amazing and have great gut health, and other people again might really struggle. And if you are struggling, I think it's really hard to get better if you're like a marathoner. Still think that that's like probably out of the norm for what we deal with. But I do see those people that are like hyper into wellness, like fitness, I should say, and they kind of go overboard. And then you see the other people that maybe need to move more and their movement's a little bit on the lower end. And so it is something where you have to kind of find something you like, something easing into it and building up tolerance to like slightly more intense exercise might be something to consider too, versus jumping into like a boot campy type scenario. Well,
and I think this can actually feed into some of the other root causes, right? Because like you said earlier in the episode, the amount of exercise and movement that you're doing is going to dictate how many calories you need to take in and like what sort of macros you might need. So somebody who's doing a lot of powerlifting might need more protein. Somebody who's training for a marathon might need more carbs. Right. And anybody who's working out a lot is surely going to need more calories. So that kind of feeds into the nutrition side. But also, throwing this out there, if you are exercising a lot and you're also not sleeping well, like overtraining and over exercising can affect your sleep, and then crappy sleep is going to like impact your ability to recover from that exercise. So those two can feed into each other. Mental health is huge. How many people have we seen who gasp at the thought of decreasing their exercise because that's like their only stress management tool?
Yeah. Yeah.
And maybe that's not the best. Like if you find that your mental health is better and your stress feels more manageable when you exercise, that's great. I'm glad that you found a tool that works for you. And that is well documented in the literature. However, if you're at a point where like you can't ever take a break from training and the thought of doing so is like absolute madness to you, because if you don't exercise, your stress is just going to go through the roof and you have zero other coping mechanisms to deal with that, that's not a good thing. And maybe you need to look at the other root cause a little bit deeper.
Right. I have a friend from high school, and I talk about her with another friend from high school because she's like an ultra marathoner, and she had this weird kind of serious health issue after a race. And so we keep trying to get her to like scale back. You know, she's running these races that are like 50 miles. And me and my other friend that are worried about her will say stuff like, what is she running from? Like that could be a good question, because again, if we could figure out what she's running from or like what she's avoiding or whatever, and that she can't pull back very easily from exercise, maybe it would help her kind of figure out maybe what the next steps could be to address that. But yeah, I think again, the exercise piece for the over-exercisers can be really interesting to try to unpack. But yeah, you're right. I think priority-wise, when you're thinking about movement, usually like movement and physical activity are the most helpful when you can push yourself. I forget what the term is. It's like functional gains or something. There's some term where you're basically pushing yourself out of your physical comfort zone, and that causes stress, and that's what it damages muscle. Like when you work out, muscle damage basically happens when you like lift weights and stuff, or you move your body and you're building muscle, and then you are supposed to have enough resources to come in and like lead this big recovery effect where your muscles actually get bigger and stronger to accommodate for that stress. But the problem is, I think, with some individuals is that they're pushing themselves beyond what their body has the capacity to recover from. And so it just creates more stress. Yeah. So if you don't have the other tools like the sleep, nutrition, and you're pushing yourself, even if you're not going to the extreme, but you're still pushing yourself a little bit beyond your comfort zone, that might be too much for you if other factors aren't addressed. I've seen this a little bit with me. Sometimes if I did weight training a little, like 3 days a week versus 2, and I didn't adjust my nutrition, I felt like my hormones got a little weird. Like I almost feel like it was too much stress for my body if I wasn't careful about upping nutrition. It was like there was almost this limit for me where I felt best maybe at 2 days a week, unless I was going to push nutritionally. And I just sort of would stick to the 2 days a week of harder workouts and do like more low intensity, moderate workouts other days. But again, I think it's about finding that nuance of like stressing enough to where you can build strength and recover, but not stressing too much to where you don't have the ability to recover properly.
Yeah. If you think about it, if you think of your capabilities on a scale of like 0 to 100, you want to push it just to like 105. Right. Occasionally. Not every day, not all the time, but like you want to just push it to like 105, maybe 110. And then you go back somewhere within your range. You go back down to like 60 or whatever. And, you're not going at 200 every single day and like, doing something that's way beyond your capacity. It's you stress the system enough that you get physiological changes and adaptation, and then you give it a rest, and then you stress the system a teeny bit, and then you give it a rest. And that's how you train smarter.
Right.
Side note, I'll share this and then we'll wrap up. Did I ever tell you? So I was a very large ballerina.
Oh, really? Okay.
I'm 6 feet tall. I'm at my healthiest weight, I'm like 180 something pounds. So I'm a larger woman anyway. But I actually did tap, ballet, and jazz for, I think it was 4th grade through 10th grade. So whoa. I was like the 6 foot tall ballerina. I was not good at it. Don't get me wrong. I was quite bad actually. But that was like my once a week thing. That was my one movement thing that I got into. I remember distinctly my teacher cautioned us once and said, now girls, you don't ever weightlift. she's like this older lady.
Right.
But she said, don't ever weightlift because weightlifting damages your muscles. And we were all like, oh shit.
Right.
Okay. Understood.
Right.
And now having a bachelor's degree in exercise science, I chuckle at that memory because I'm like, yes. And that's how it works.
Right. Right. That's the point.
You damage the muscle fibers, and then the repair process comes in, and your body kind of gets the memo. Oh, if I'm going to have to do this occasionally, I probably need to rebuild bigger and better and stronger. And that's where you get the adaptation that you want. So yes, there is damage, quote unquote, but it's a good thing as long as you're smart about it. But, that was old school ballerina. She could have just said, don't lift heavy because you'll get big and bulky, and that's like not favorable for ballet if you're big and bulky. That would have been such a more logical explanation. But yeah, don't weightlift because it causes muscle damage. I'm sure there's some influencer out there on the internet telling women the exact same thing here in 2024, and we just haven't stumbled on that Instagram post yet. But yeah, be careful with what you choose to consume out in the wild, wild west that is the internet. Hopefully you will choose to come join us for the IBS Freedom podcast again, because presumably it's one of the best things you have yet to find here on the nets. And until then, we will bid you adieu.